Hi, and welcome to this module on the environment. So in this brief overview, I want to look at three topics underlying U.S. environmental problems. The first is that of collective action failures. The second is that of negative externalities. And then the third is NIMBY movements. All right, let's go. So you've probably heard of collective action failures, at least by one name or another, perhaps in another social science class, a political science class, or an environmental class. And another way that we refer to a collective action failure is the free riding problem. And one example that I'll share in the module is the prisoner's dilemma. And the basis of this example is that we fail to coordinate our actions in a way that would be beneficial for all or that would be mutually beneficial. And typically this is because of a irrational rationalization. We assume that if we do the right thing, that we might be taken advantage of or that others won't do the right thing. And so we kind of have a reactive response even before there's an action, where we're unwilling to be the one that didn't take advantage of the situation. So, for example, if there is, like a program for transit, and we know that if people started to ride public transit more often, then we would have more reliable public transportation. We would perhaps have just like obviously better environmental results, that it could save people time in traffic, it could save money, it could really decongest the roads and get everybody where they want to go on time. However, many of us think, well, okay, if I do it, what happens if nobody else does it? And then I'm the sucker who's been riding public transportation, and it's never going to decongest, right? Because everybody else keeps doing it. And so we don't work together because we're afraid that others will free ride, right? And a lot of that is because we kind of just don't trust each other. We think that everyone will act in their own self-interests, whereas the exact opposite is true, that if people see others acting, without self-interest, then they are also encouraged, or they can trust that it's safe for them to also do so. So other ways that people kind of rationalize their activity or inactivity when it comes to like conservation, when it comes to sustainability, is these ideas of like, it's too much trouble, or thinking that, my own efforts or wastes won't really make a difference, that is just a drop in the bucket. And while individual efforts, in and of themselves won't be like paradigm shifting, they do add up, and they do hold to task those who can make these big power moves, right? And so, we should definitely, be leaning towards trying to do all that we can in order to, uh, I guess, reverse climate change. But, to ensure that we can sustain, comfortable living for as long as possible. Um, so Americans still oppose mandatory regulations despite them being in their best interest because, we just do. We don't like being told what to do. We have a thing with freedoms. America's freedom paradigm is very much wanting the freedom to do what you want, less than the freedom from adversity. And so we would rather just have this open slate to be able to do anything that we want with no one telling us what to do, rather than to be free of some really bad negative externalities. And actually, that's going to be our next topic. So a negative externality is a negative effect of our choices and actions. And those negative externalities can impact us directly as individuals, but typically they will always impact someone else. So when you act, there's always somebody who's going to be in some way impacted by your action, right? There used to be this movie, it was like Ashton Kutcher from long ago called The Butterfly Effect. And so it's kind of like that, only real. In that, I mean, like, of course, the butterfly effect is real as a weather phenomenon, but as an Ashton Kutcher's life and fate, I don't know about that. But anyway, so with negative externalities, when we make decisions, they impact other people. And that's where we run into a little problem when it comes to those freedoms I talked about previously, because we want to be able to do anything we want as long as we don't hurt anyone else. Unfortunately, a lot of our choices and decisions and actions can impact people whether we want them or not. So, when it comes to negative externalities, there are some concerns about our individual consumption choices. We're really short sighted. We ignore the fact often that resources are finite because they just seem so plentiful, right? Everything seems so massive. And we assume to some extent that we will figure out a solution, right? That we are smart and we have knowledge and that we can overcome our challenges. And I really hope that's true. Another reason is because of selfishness, especially in the global north, which is the northern hemisphere of the globe. We have entitlement to use these resources because we can afford them. And we don't see firsthand often the depletion of our non renewable resources because a lot of it is happening outside of our visible sphere. We have concerns with US corporations and their production choices as well. Their decisions are made based on profits, not for the well being of the nation. And again, super short sighted, even more so than individuals. Because what are corporations focused on? The quarter, right? Their long term goals are maybe 1 year in advance. A corporation is not focusing on 5, 10, 15, 20 years, 50 years from now. Okay. They are focused on maximizing profits, and the costs to the external environment are displaced, right? They make it part of what happens as a result of us moving a lot of industry and manufacturing and agricultural environmental hazards overseas is that we don't see them. And so we as consumers don't necessarily have the imperative. We don't see visibly from North America, right? We're far away from everyone. We don't see the negative externalities in action. We don't see where the waste is getting dumped. We don't see the acid rain or the impacts of nitrogen fertilizers and other practices. So just a couple more points here before I bring it home. NIMBY, right? So NIMBY is a particular type of negative externality concern, and it's not as cute as the acronym, unfortunately. NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard, and you've probably heard of this before. Typically, geographical locations must be found for our undesirable activities, so toxic waste dumps, asylums, sewage plants, etc. There's always got to be somewhere for these things to go. And so I'm really interested when we start talking about bringing production back to the United States, knowing all that we know about environmental problems, carcinogens, like everything that we know. Who's going to allow this production to occur in their backyard? Who should be the victims of the proximity of dangerous and hazardous practices? And all of these things have to happen somewhere. No one wants it in their backyard for so many different reasons. I think this is the most superficial one. Whenever I see someone say, oh, but my property value, I just want to throttle them. But that's one of the reasons. People don't want their property value to decrease, right? And we know that if you live next to the sewage plant, then you're probably not going to have the highest property values, right? The one that I think is most important and what everyone should be focused on is the negative effects, right? What are you downstream from, and how are you impacted? We can see that there are different rates depending on, the proximity of one living near um, nuclear waste or sewage or factories, or places where there's lots of fires, and that this can lead to differences in health outcomes and development, right? And some people will say like, oh, well, why would you live there? You should move. Well, guess which is the most affordable housing? The undesirable housing. And sometimes those unwanted locations come in after homes have already been built, after people have already settled down. Now, the thing about NIMBY is that it often struggles with tyranny of the majority, right? And tyranny of the majority basically says that often, in order to serve and to convenience the majority of people in a population, a minority of a population usually takes the brunt of the negative externalities or the negative results and outcomes. Unfortunately, this minority often ends up being the same group time after time. It ends up being people who are low income, or people who are people of color or indigenous people, and so on. So this turns NIMBY actually into an environmental justice and environmental racism issue. So it's not just a environmental issue, and most environmental issues are not just environmental issues. It's not just about keeping people safe, but also the fact that some people are more likely to be put into these precarious situations time after time after time again. So quickly, just to define those two terms, environmental justice, or environmental inequality, is this notion that the sources of environmental pollution are unevenly distributed among various social groups and categories. And typically a specific group is going to be disproportionately affected by negative externalities and environmental conditions that are brought about by unequal policies, unequal laws, or unequal regulations, which are kind of all the same things. And it can be formal or informal, either way. And environmental racism is a form of environmental inequality, except here we are seeing a deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, for not maintaining water systems, for sanctioning poisons and pollutants in those communities, and for excluding people of color from decision-making roles and from conversations. So here are a couple of claims that kind of support this. Marginalized people are more likely to reside near hazardous environments and be targeted for dirty industries. And it's getting harder to place these hazards and dirty industries in middle-class white communities. And a lot of this is related to our old friend neoliberalism as well, which has contributed to these justifications for how places are chosen, right? Politically and economically, because as long as the environment has to bow down to the economy and politics, then the decision making is going to be not focused on people, but on money, right? And so how can you blame a corporation for going to that place? You just need to have more money than them. You need to gain resources. And so living outside of the scope of negative externalities is a privilege and not a right. Okay. So yeah.